Welcome to The Prescription, the Tax Policy Center's biweekly webcast on fiscal policy. This is one of a series of conversations with state, local, and federal government officials, as well as leading economists and other experts. I'm your host, Howard Gleckman, a senior fellow at TPC and editor of our blog, TaxVox. My guest today is David Wessel, director of the Brookings Institution Hutchins Center on Fiscal and Monetary Policy. Before joining Brookings, David was a reporter, editor, and columnist at the Wall Street Journal, where, among other things, he covered the tax policy beat for many years. David's the author of a new book on opportunity zones called Only the Rich Can Play: How Washington Works in the New Gilded Age. Before we begin, our usual bit of housekeeping. We encourage audience members to submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. The event is being recorded and will be posted online at TPC's website. We're using captioning, which you can adjust or turn off with the live transcript button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. If you'd like to join the conversation on social media, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. And if you'd like to suggest a future guest for The Prescription, just email us at info@taxpolicycenter.org. David Wessel, welcome to The Prescription.
Thank you, Howard. It's good to be with you.
Good to be with you, and Happy New Year.
And you.
So Only the Rich Can Play describes in fascinating detail how opportunity zones came to be included in the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and then it exposes the implications of that decision. So let's start at the beginning. What are opportunity zones and how do they work?
So the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act created 8,764 tax havens across the country, census tracts in which a wealthy, and they're almost all wealthy, person or corporation can invest in almost anything and get a cut on a deferral and a reduction in their capital gains tax on whatever they sell for the initial investment. And then if they hold the property for 10 years, they escape capital gains taxes altogether on any profits they make on that investment.
So opportunity zones are not the first federal programs intended to encourage economic development. There were before opportunity zones, there were enterprise zones and empowerment zones and renewal communities and new market tax credits. How do the opportunity zones differ from these early attempts besides the sheer scale of them?
Sure. So first of all, all these tax incentives are attempts to address a significant and actually growing economic problem. That is the widening gap between parts of the country, communities that are doing well and communities that aren't. And one of the motivators behind these policies is trying to do something to invest in those places that need investment for a variety of reasons, which I can talk about why many economists who used to be against these things now are for them. The biggest difference between opportunity zones and all the things that went before them is there's no constraint on this. There's no competition, so there's no oversight from the Treasury to decide what projects or what opportunity funds meet the criteria or not. So for instance, you mentioned the new markets tax credit. Well, Congress appropriates a certain amount of money that can be foregone taxes that can go to new market tax credit projects, and the Treasury decides who gets that money, essentially. The proponents of opportunity zones, it started with Sean Parker of Napster and Facebook fame, thought that the problem with those things are there was so much red tape, so many rules, that they discouraged lots of investors from participating and actually created a cottage industry of experts and institutions that just existed to exploit them. I think that they have a point, but that they went too far in the opposite direction. And so there's nothing to, first of all, they made some mistakes in how they selected the communities. We can talk about that. But secondly, since there's no oversight, we have a Ritz-Carlton hotel and condo complex going up in Portland, Oregon. We have self-storage facilities being built with opportunity zone investment money, and self-storage facilities, nice as they are, don't create any jobs at all.
So let's talk about one of the flaws, and you've already mentioned it, which is the 8,764 zones. So you can see the political benefits to this. Every congressman, senator, and governor gets their own pet zones. But it also sowed the seeds for the policy failure. What was the problem with creating so many eligible communities?
So the way this worked was the law set some criteria, largely borrowed from the new markets tax credit, to identify census tracts that were eligible for opportunity zone treatment. 56% of all the census tracts in America were eligible. Then, because the proponents of opportunity zones had a certain antipathy to Washington, they said that governors should decide which 25% of the eligible census tracts in their state should be designated. Now, the notion that somehow there's politics in Washington and not at the state capitol is, of course, ridiculous. They didn't give the governors much time nor much guidance about how to select the things. Some governors picked foolishly, some were corrupt, and some honestly tried to do a good job, but this whole thing was sprung on them, and they had sort of a very interesting policy dilemma. I focus a little bit on Portland, Oregon, in part because Oregon is a state where there's no evidence or allegation of corruption, and where, thanks to the Freedom of Information Act, we have a lot of insight into emails that were going back and forth among the people in the state and county level to decide what tracts to get designated. So imagine you're the governor's economic development aid in Oregon. On one hand, you could pick only the worst off zones, and you could feel good, but you might not get any money because the neighboring state of Washington or California might make a different choice. So what Oregon did was about half the zones are really bad off places, and half the zones are places that actually probably in any kind of rough justice way shouldn't have qualified, but they did, like downtown Portland. Downtown Portland, Oregon, which before the recent civil disruptions was a pretty prosperous place, has a number of low-income housing projects that were the city kept as the downtown developed. So the census tract looks poor on paper and it was eligible, but in fact, they're building office buildings and condos. And so what does that tell us? One is, if you have that many zones, the real estate industry in particular is going to be really good at figuring out the ones that don't really need the money. Austin, Texas, which is one of the fastest growing metro areas in the country, the city government asked for 4 census tracts to be designated. For reasons I don't know, the governor gave them 21. The only data we have of any that's any administrative data is from some work that a couple of economists, one of whom the Joint Tax Committee did, and looking at 2019 tax returns, they found that 84% of the zones got no money, and half the money went to the best off 1% of zones. And that's not surprising. You know, if you're in the real estate business and you're not a social impact investor, and let's face it, most of them are not, you're going to pick the places that probably shouldn't have been picked, but why not get the capital gains tax break? And so that's what happened.
So to put it another way, a lot of this money, it sounds like, went to projects that would have been built anyway.
A lot of this money went to communities that were already attracting public investment. A lot of it went to projects that were already in the works that might have been speeded up because they got cheap financing. A lot of it went to projects that definitely would have been built otherwise. Maybe the financing would have been a little more expensive, but if a condo or office tower is more expensive, I'm not sure that's a public policy issue. There are some, and I make this point in the book, there are some people who are using opportunity zones for the purposes, the stated intention. So it's not like nobody is doing the right thing. It's just there's no requirement to do the right thing. And most of the money is not going to what I think these things were sold as.
And all else equal, if I'm an investor, I'm going to put my money in an up and coming community, in a Ritz-Carlton hotel in an up and coming community, rather than putting it in a community that's in a very bad way.
Exactly. So like I had an interesting conversation with, of all people, Anthony Scaramucci, the guy who was for a nanosecond the Trump PR guy, who's a great self-promoter. And he announced that he was going to raise $3 billion in opportunity zone money. In the end, he raised $45 million and did one project, a Virgin hotel in New Orleans, in a gentrifying part of New Orleans. He made a point, which actually some serious scholars have made, is if you're going to do something like this, maybe you have to give an even bigger tax break to get people to invest in really, really, really troubled neighborhoods instead of having the one size fits all. I don't know if that would work, but there's some logic to that.
But this is already a really, really big tax break.
Yes, it is. We don't really know how
imagine
much it's going to cost. The architects of this program were very clever. So as I mentioned, you have to have unrealized capital gains to participate. You realize those gains and you get to defer the taxes. You get a discount, but you get to defer payment until 2026. So when you look at the 10-year cost estimate, there's a big revenue bump in 2026, a positive one, that wipes out all the losses over the first 10 years. But then, of course, the big foregone revenue losses are beyond year 10, and they don't show up in the 10-year estimate. And one of the things that's worth watching is there are some people who are arguing, well, we should delay that 2026 thing. Let's change the law and make it 2028. And their argument is, well, COVID and all that. But in fact, there's some evidence that this was designed as like an extender, that they could always push off the date of payment because it would always be revenue within the 10-year window.
Sure. Another tax extender, just what we need.
Exactly.
So you and I are both old tax reporters. Let's maybe say long time.
You may be
reporters.
old. I'm not. I have a real problem with economists who describe prime age as 25 to 54. Trying to wipe that out.
Yeah, we got to do something about that. I want to ask you though, as a longtime tax reporter myself, and you being one too, you made a very interesting choice by putting one relatively tiny corner of the tax law under the microscope. It's very different from, say, Showdown at Gucci Gulch, that was a broad look at the politics between the passage of the entire 1986 Tax Reform Act. I'm curious about, why did you decide to go micro and give readers a detailed look at just one piece of the TCJA?
That's a good question. I never contemplated doing a Gucci Gulch style thing on the entire tax bill. What drew me to this, and originally, was our colleague who you know well, Adam Looney, Adam Looney is capable of more moral outrage about a small provision in the tax code than any other economist I've ever met. So Adam was fulminating about this, and I was interested in it initially as a policy issue about, can we do place-based policies well? But then he mentioned that Sean Parker was involved, and I thought, oh, this could be an interesting story. So there are two ways to tell this stuff. One is to go big and one is to go micro. One advantage of doing an opportunity zone thing, besides the characters, and what I thought pre-pandemic would be an opportunity to do a lot of travel around the United States, is that you can understand the thing in a paragraph. Whereas when you start to write about the corporate tax code, it's very hard to explain to people, the overseas income, interest deduction, all the games that people play. So I think that's a harder way to do it. I also thought this was an illustration of how behind the scenes, a really rich guy with, honestly, I think he thought he had a good idea, could get something into the tax code, while a lot of other people with good ideas can't. So it's both the story of how the tax code works, but also about the politics of a modern era where people with wealth can buy more access to policymakers than the rest of us.
So let's talk about Sean Parker a little bit. Not the kind of character you usually see in tax stories. Rarely do either of us ever write about a guy who was played by Justin Timberlake in a Hollywood movie. Tell me about what he was first thinking when he came up with opportunity zones. I know you say in the book that he originally thought about this as an international economic development.
Right. So first of all, I think you have to put Sean Parker in the category of other Silicon Valley successful entrepreneurs who think that their mission in life is to hack the system. That is, they're better at seeing out of the box ways to make life better than the people who are in the trenches, because the people in the trenches are so embedded in the bureaucracy and so wedded to the old ideas. So that's the way he approaches everything. That's how he approached the music industry and Napster. It's how he approached cancer research. He spent a lot of energy on the immunology side of cancer. And you're right. He says that he first saw this idea when he was looking at the failures of foreign aid in places like Africa, where there would never be enough foreign aid to raise living standards. You needed private capital, and the private capital needed to help spur entrepreneurship. When it got moved to the US context, he and some of his allies really did think about this as a way to get venture capital off the coast and into the heartland. That is, he was more interested in investing in businesses than in real estate. I think this is a sign of his naivete, because I don't think it's particularly well suited for small business startups and is particularly easily exploited by real estate. So he has this idea. He's clever. He doesn't make a fool of himself the way Mark Zuckerberg did when he had a press conference and said, I'm going to fix Newark schools and here's hundreds of millions of dollars. Instead, he hires a couple of Washington insiders, Steve Glickman, a Democrat, John Lettieri, a Republican, and builds this little think tank, the Economic Innovation Group, that very skillfully makes the case that geographic inequality is a problem in America without presenting their solution. And then after a couple of years of that, lo and behold, we've established it's a problem. We've done lots of indices. We've talked to lots of newspapers and members of Congress. Here's our solution, the opportunity zone. So I think that's an interesting illustration of how Washington works at this time that is easier to explain and not as obvious as America's multinationals would like to pay less taxes, so they hire a lot of lobbyists and make a lot of campaign contributions so that the corporate tax increase that President Biden proposes is going nowhere, or the carried interest crowd.
So it's interesting. He originally it seemed like was shopping this to Democrats. People like Ro Khanna were very interested in this. But when they sort of started this Washington operation, he was encouraged to make this bipartisan, which turned out to be a fortuitous decision. Tell me about that.
So I think he and his people thought that the way to have lasting policy change is to make it bipartisan. And they recognized that they had talking points that were pretty attractive to both Democrats and Republicans. And the reason they got so many co-sponsors was because the talking points were great. We're going to give rich people incentive to put money into poor communities that really need it. I mean, who could be against that? I mean, the alternative, I suppose, is we raise their taxes and the government puts the money in, but that's not very politically popular. And the notion that you could tell a congressman like Pat Tiberi, a Democrat from Ohio, that this is designed to get wealthy people to put money in the poor parts of your Ohio district was very appealing. The reason they wanted Democrats was to immunize them against the notion that this was a tax cut for the rich. And the reason they wanted Republicans was to say this is a tax cut for the rich that helps the poor. So it was like the perfect talking points. They also had a very well-diversified political portfolio. They had Tim Scott, Republican of South Carolina, Cory Booker, Democrat of New Jersey. They worked with Jared Bernstein, who's a Democrat economist now in the CEA, and Kevin Hassett, a Republican. So they spent a lot of time building this bipartisan, infrastructure because they thought that was the best way to get done. I think it proved very smart because, like everybody else, they expected Hillary to win. That then Cory Booker would be their point person. Instead, Donald Trump won, and Tim Scott turned out to be key to the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, and this was his thing. He got this into the law without a lot of attention. It wasn't in the House bill, despite Paul Ryan's affection for enterprise zones and his after-the-fact support of the program. He didn't let it go in. He was discouraged it from going, or certainly didn't get it into the House bill. And I think I just made a mistake. I referred to Tiberi as a Democrat. Tiberi is, of course, a Republican. Right. Tiberi wanted to be chairman of Ways and Means, didn't make it. Kevin Brady got it. He wasn't interested in opportunity zones. So really, in this case, they had a very well-diversified portfolio, and one of their assets, Tim Scott, really paid off. And he's a believer.
So let's talk about Tim Scott. And it's interesting, like every successful venture, this one had more than his fair share of good luck. And the good luck for this, weirdly enough, was the white nationalist riot in Charlottesville and Donald Trump's response to it. So Explain how that made it possible for Congress to pass opportunity zones.
Well, it definitely played a role. The Trump White House, despite the fact that Kevin Hassett and Jerome Smith, who was another opportunity zone advocate in the administration, was not making this a priority in the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. The people like Gary Cohn at the National Economic Council were not very enthusiastic, and they were very focused on the corporate tax cuts and stuff. So the White House was kind of on the sidelines, not giving Tim Scott much support. After President Trump's unfortunate remarks about fine people on both sides in Charlottesville, Tim Scott was very outspoken criticizing the president. The White House invited him to meet with the president. He went down, worried that he might have a confrontation, but instead found the president in his listening mode. And at the end of the conversation, the president said, well, what can I do to make it up to the people I've hurt with my remarks? And Tim Scott was ready for that. And he said, you can support my opportunity zones initiative. So Jerome Smith was a low-level guy in the Domestic Policy Council, tells me that his phone rang and the legislative affairs guy in the White House, Mark Short, says, that opportunity zone thing you keep talking about, we're doing it, what is it? And so the president the next day on Air Force One, meeting with reporters, asked about his meeting with Tim Scott, said, I support this thing. Yeah. And I suspect the president understood right away. I think Donald Trump understands tax breaks in real estate. So the idea that there was going to be a capital gains tax break that real estate developers could use to build in 8,764 census tracts, I'm sure he got it and saw the appeal.
So let's pivot and talk a little bit about the consequences of this. As we've noted, the first part of the book is a fascinating political story. The second part really does try to unpack what opportunity zones have actually achieved as opposed to what their sponsors thought. So as we start getting into this, we have a question from a guy you may know, a guy named Mark Mazur. He says, can we think about opportunity zones as a like-kind exchange on steroids? Real estate investors have experience with like-kind exchanges as a way to defer capital gains taxes, perhaps indefinitely. This just amps up the incentives. Is that a good way to think about this?
Yeah, but it is. And in fact, there are a number, I talked to some real estate people who explained to me why they'd gone away from the 1031 like-kind exchange to opportunity zones. Because with a like-kind exchange, if you sell a building, you have to put the gross proceeds into the next building in order to avoid paying capital gains taxes. With opportunity, that was originally in some early drafts of this. With opportunity zones, you only have to put the capital gain. Your basis does not go into the thing. So yes, I think that's right. So it's not surprising. I think one of Sean Parker's mistakes was not appreciating just how aggressive the real estate tax avoidance industry is. So all those people from EB5 and 1031, they just moved, this is another one, we know how to do this, and they did.
So you were faced with kind of a research challenge. As you mentioned, these were extremely opaque. It's hard to get sort of macro data on what's going on. So you made a decision again to go micro. We focused on two cities, Baltimore and Portland, Oregon. You told us a little bit about what happened in Portland. What did you find in Baltimore?
So Baltimore seems to me the kind of place that opportunity zones were supposed to help. And basically what I found is the grittier parts of Baltimore didn't get very much money. There's a huge project on the south end of Baltimore, but that's one that already had substantial city subsidies and a big investment from Goldman Sachs before opportunity zones really came along. So it may have been supercharged by opportunity zones, but it's clearly opportunity zones were not the reason that's there. I like to talk about one block in West Baltimore that I visited, which, is five or six row houses, one of which is occupied and the rest are just shells. And there's a guy there who got some opportunity zone money as part of his effort to rehab that block, but he got $1.5 million in opportunity zone money, which is less than the cost of a one-bedroom condo at that Ritz-Carlton in Portland. So, it lends itself to newspaper-style anecdotal reporting because we don't have much data. There's a risk, of course, that you cherry pick. I tried to avoid that. I talked to lots of people in Portland and lots of people in Baltimore. I think I found every single opportunity zone project in Baltimore because there's an opportunity zone coordinator for the city. I also talk about, as I said, places like South LA, where I think Martin Wodo at Sola Impact is using opportunity zone money for exactly the intended or stated purpose, that is to finance affordable housing.
So we got another question, which I think raises some interesting issues. It identifies this research that was done by Good Jobs First that found that Amazon has constructed a number of warehouses and opportunity zones. Amazon denies this, but it raises a really interesting question. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? You could think about, does Amazon need the subsidy? On the other hand, these are jobs.
So I don't think we know anything about Amazon and whether they're taking advantage. I did the arithmetic. I think something like so there's something like 70,000 census tracts in the US, and there are 8,000 opportunity zones. So at random, Amazon's going to be there. So we don't know. I think the question is, there is no requirement that an opportunity zone investment benefit the people in the community, or indeed any requirement whatsoever that there are any employment things. So I don't really care if something goes into a community that they want and it will provide good jobs. And I think that's the case with Amazon. I think the people are very suspicious of Amazon because they assume they're doing everything to reduce their taxes. An alternative, I wish we knew more about the corporate use of opportunity zones in cell phone towers. Cell phone towers are a great example of how a big company can locate a tower on the roof of a building in an opportunity zone that it doesn't do anything for the community, and they were going to build a cell phone tower anyways. And so I think that there's a lot to be learned. I'm hoping that the Treasury and Congress can squeeze more data out of opportunity zone investors so we can do some serious work. And I'm prepared to change my mind if my anecdotal reporting is misleading. I don't think it is. And as I said, that initial Joint Tax Committee work makes me think it is. I see Pete Davis has asked if there've been any revisions to the OZ score. The answer is yes, but around the margins, nothing significant.
So one of the other uses for this you discovered, which also seems kind of counterintuitive until you think about it a little more, is fancy housing for college students.
Right.
So of course, communities with lots of college students are low-income communities because they're college students, they're not really working, they're eligible, but why housing for these guys?
Well, first of all, there's an example of how we should have thought more about how we pick the zones if we're going to do a program like this. Either there should be some tighter restrictions, we should use more current data, or the Treasury should have some oversight function here. These communities look poor, as you say, because college kids have no income. It turns out there's a big industry. It's an asset class of its own now called student housing. It's rental student housing for people. Some places don't have enough dorms, and other places the rich parents allow their kids to rent nice apartments in buildings with roof decks and gyms and all sorts of other amenities. It's a pretty good deal for landlords, I understand, because first of all, the parents guarantee the rent, and secondly, they turn over every year, so you can raise the rent. And that's an example of how, when you do something like this, there's going to be some people who are in the business of real estate and say, this is just another way for us to cut our cost of capital. So I think in most cases, that's not a good use of opportunity zone money. Those places shouldn't have been designated. And there are proposals in Congress to allow governors to revisit the zone choices, to maybe knock out some of the places that were chosen that, with the benefit of hindsight, or could have been foresight, shouldn't have been chosen.
So it sounds like the biggest winners of this, we've talked about, the investors who, some of them did okay, but a lot of them were not interested in this. So I think the biggest winners really were the people who already own land in the designated zones.
Now, the evidence of that is not convincing yet. Maybe you have to be able, it's hard. There are ways to get around it by doing leases to benefit yourself. So you probably have to sell it. And it's not clear from the data we've seen whether that's actually happened. I mean, you could imagine it would. Look, frankly, I think the biggest winners are probably the middlemen. There are a lot of investors who are going to make a killing. People who are investing in real estate that they have every reason to believe will appreciate, and they're going to escape capital gains taxes when they unload it a decade from now. But the second crowd are all the people in the middle, and there are a lot of them. I went to a Opportunity Zone Expo at the Mandalay Bay in Las Vegas, and I was just stunned by the number of people who are in the business of trying to help rich people exploit the tax code to cut their taxes and getting a piece of the action along the way.
And of course, you also noted that the Mandalay Bay is itself in an opportunity zone.
Absolutely, yeah.
Who knew?
That's an interesting story about Las Vegas.
Absolutely. One last question. We've just about out of time, but one final question, which was these flaws that you've identified were not unknown to the sponsors of the bill. They went to people who were experts, including my colleague at the Urban Institute, Brett Theodos, who told them about all of these problems, yet they didn't change it. Why not?
I don't really know. I think they were arrogant, and I think they thought that people like Brett Theodos wanted them to put guardrails on this thing that would limit its attractiveness to investors. They were much more worried about how to make this attractive to investors than they were about making sure that it went for the desired purpose. So that's why my bottom line is that I think this has done, unfortunately, more to reduce the taxes of wealthy people than to improve the living conditions of people in these poor neighborhoods. And I think that we should either fix the program, or if we can't fix it, we should kill it.
David Wessel, thank you so much for taking the time. It's great to talk to you as always. And suggest to our audience, go out and get the book. Only the Rich Can Play.
Absolutely.
Terrific book.
Thanks very much. Good to be with you. And I'm glad to see so many people, even some familiar names on the participants list.
Absolutely. Happy New Year to you, and Happy New Year to our audience. Take care.